A musician wakes from a terrible nightmare. In their dream, they find themselves in a society where music education has become mandatory. Now, since musicians are known to set their ideas down in the form of sheet music, it's imperative that students learn this language. It would be ridiculous to expect a student to play an instrument or sing a song without that fundamental grounding in music notation and theory. For most, music class is dull and boring, too dry to ever pique their interest. In fact, it's more of an exercise, if you will, an exercise in the rote memorization of scales, chords, arpeggios, without ever actually getting to experience the music. Now, in fact, most students couldn't even care less how important music is in today's society. They just want to take the minimum number of music courses there is and get it over and done with. As a result, very few ever actually get to hear the sounds that the notes on sheet music represent. Now, this allegory comes from the essay, A Mathematician's Lament, by mathematician Paul Lockhart. And in it, he argues that the state of maths education today mirrors this very nightmare. Now, something that really stood out to me when I first read this, as a musician, was I just found it quite bizarre to ever imagine a society where we would approach teaching music or any other art in this way. One of the reasons I love music is I'm just able to throw myself into it, play what I feel, express myself through sound. And yes, music theory, music notation, these are all very important things. These are useful tools that enable us to communicate with our fellow musicians. But I don't think being good at music theory necessarily constitutes being a good musician. In fact, some of my favorite musicians never even knew how to read sheet music. One of my favorite jazz pianists, Jarell Garner, was one of them. And he once said, they don't come to hear you read, they come to hear you play. And that's something that really stood out to me. Now, what does all of this have to do with science? Well, let me tell you. So, all of this got me thinking about the way we approach science and math education. And I've always been really interested in how the world works, how things work, and want to get those answers to those big questions like, how will the universe end? Or, are there any bigger numbers than infinity? So I did what any reasonable person would do. I took a bunch of science classes. And so I walk in, open my laptop, open my notebook, get out my pens and pencils. The teacher gives out a lecture, scribble as much of it down as possible, cram all this information into our heads. And then we do this for the next class, and the next class, and the next class. We do this repeat, ad nauseum, rinse and wash every single day, 5 days a week, for weeks on end. We do the assignments, we do the homework, then we get to the exams. We set the exams, we've crammed as much information into our heads as possible, and we just regurgitate it onto that paper. Then we're done. Cool. Neat. So we go and have a holiday for a couple of weeks, and we come back and we do the same thing over and over and over and over. But how often do we really get to appreciate what we're learning? I think sometimes we don't go to school to learn about what we're supposed to be learning, but we go to school to learn how to take a test, right? We go to school to learn how to get those skills and being able to show your knowledge in a very, very specific situation. And we're not really acquainting ourselves with the subject matter as deeply as we could be. So bear with me, because I want to tell you guys a story. Now, my speaker coach, Bradley, lovely person. You should all say hi to him. He's great. He's actually been on my back about this, and he said, Jarell, if you're going to have slides and pictures and stuff, they need to be crystal clear. They need to be perfect. They need to be like ultra high definition. And so I've spent countless hours, many sleepless nights trying to just get you guys the best pictures possible to really elevate that TEDx experience. So I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Joe. Now, Joe, like many of you, hasn't seen their grandparents in a couple of years because of the pandemic. But hey, Joe has had their vaccines, their boosters, and and as restrictions have eased up a little bit, well, Joe's decided, you know what? I think I'm going to go visit my grandparents. So what does Joe do? Joe packs his car with all the things you might need for a weekend out. A bunch of suitcases, potted plants, guitars, toothbrushes, more suitcases, more toothbrushes, even more toothbrushes. Anyway, so Joe drives along, lovely little journey, and as he gets to the end of his journey, he comes across a ravine. And to get to Joe's grandparents on the other side of the ravine, he has to cross this bridge. And this bridge is kind of dodgy. It's a bunch of planks of wood stuck together by 2 bits of wire. And, you know, it's a bit of a safety hazard, but it gets the job done. It carries the weight of Joe's car. Cool, fine and dandy. But something terrible happened during the pandemic. And there was a terrible storm. And it put a lot of pressure on that bridge. It vibrated like a violin string, if you will. It put a lot of pressure, and what happens when you put pressure on something? It'll break. And so that's what happens. And so now that Joe has come after the pandemic, half of the bridge is missing. Like, the wire is still there, but all those planks of wood, they're gone. Like, zip, gone. And there's obviously a bit of a problem with this. How is Joe going to get to his grandparents' house? Well, if Joe tries to cross the bridge now, they're going to fall to their certain doom, and we don't want that. So what is Joe going to do? Any ideas? Well, you see, the storm knocked a bunch of trees down, and there's a tree right next to Joe's car. And so Joe has a bit of an idea. What Joe does is he takes the trunk of the tree and props it up against the side of the ravine and the bridge, and forms a sort of makeshift ramp. Now, Joe has to do a bit of work, maybe polish up one of the faces of that tree to really get that nice surface to let his car drive up. Cool. There's a problem with this. You see, Joe's car is old, like really old. And it can't go up that steep incline. So what does Joe do? Splits it in two. Now, that tree that you've got there is sort of following the shape of that bridge a little closer, if you can sort of see where I'm getting to. Like, it's a little less steep. It sort of follows that original curve a little better. Cool. But there's a problem. You see, Joe packed a lot of toothbrushes, like a lot. So it's not quite going to cut it. So what does Joe do? He makes another cut. And now, as you can see, with those 3 pieces, it's a lot closer to what the bridge originally looked like. And Joe goes, you know, I could cut this as many times up as I want. And the more I cut it up, the more closely it's going to fit that bridge, that wire. And essentially, Joe can do this as many times as he wants, but 3 will probably do. So he goes, yep, that'll do the trick, and drives up to see his grandparents. Fine and dandy. Now, what if I told you that this was the essence of differential calculus? Now, I want to backtrack a little bit. Just a few minutes ago, before I told you all Joe's story, bear with me. You're in year 11. You walk into maths. I'm your teacher, big and scary. I walk into the room and I put this up on the board. And I say, today we're going to do differentiation by first principles. I'd like you all to please turn to page 78, chapter 11, and we'll start on exercise 14. Cool. Now, there's a difference in just being fed that formula and being expected to apply it versus really appreciating the story behind it. And I think it's a hard thing for science communication, because we often have these big, broad, nebulous, complex ideas and concepts, and we have to communicate them in such a way so it makes sense to people, right? And so I think sometimes school doesn't quite get it right. It's getting better, and there are definitely people out there who try. But sometimes we're all just expected to apply this thing without really understanding it. And I think, that needs to change. And I think that can change through stories. Now, Joe's story is a great example of this because we get given a person who's, or in a relatable situation and given this new approach of explaining a complex idea, distilling it down into simple words. So I'd like to stop and talk about something else for a sec. I want to talk about models. Now, ever since the beginning of human civilization, we've told each other stories. Stories to explain the natural world around us. Stories of the sun and the moon and the stars, of gods pulling the sun across the sky to form the basis of day and night. And as we've gotten better at knowing about stuff and thinking about stuff, we've changed these stories and they've become more objective. They've become more factual based. And this is the essence of models, because in reality, it's hard to describe reality without simplifying things down. So I want to talk about one of my favorite physics jokes. And it goes something like this. Assume a spherical cow. So, what? Now, there is merit in this, by the way. There is a method to this madness. Now, the reason we like to break things down, we like to make things simpler, is because it would be pointless to try and describe the precise state of a cow without going through the basics. Am I right? Yes, sort of. And I like to give an example of this through the development of the atomic model. So bear with me, chemists in the room, but once upon a time, this was an atom. It was just a ball. It was just something that made stuff up. And then some guy came along and said, I think there's probably some positively charged stuff in there and some negatively charged stuff in there, and it's like, has this magnetism thing going on. So they developed this model, which many of you will be familiar from high school, where you've got a positively charged nucleus and a bunch of electrons whizzing around. And then a little while later, in comes another dude, a quantum physicist, obsessed with cats for some reason. And he goes, yeah, no, this model works. It works in a number of situations. It's useful, but it's not quite accurate. So I'm going to change things up a bit, and I'm going to go the full Monty on this one. And we have something like this. Now, if you're interested, you can look at this in further detail, but basically, we have electron probability clouds saying, we're pretty sure the electrons are here, but we're not completely certain. Cool. Now, but there's a reason we get taught the other model first. There's a reason we don't just jump straight to this conclusion. There's a reason we start at the basics, so we're able to break stuff down and then add those layers of complexity. And I think stories are a great way to convey that. Now, I'd like to give you all one last example of a story that conveys a really, I guess, obscure idea, but in an interesting way. Now, Edwin A. Abbott was a mathematician, and he wrote this book called Flatland. And in it, there is a protagonist, and the protagonist is a two-dimensional square. So we're three-dimensional creatures because we have height, we have width, and we have depth. But square in Flatland only has two of those dimensions. It only has width and height. So it's like full-on flat. That's why we call it Flatland. Get it? Okay. One day, Square's world is turned upside down. So Square is an expert. Square knows what he's talking about. Square is like a geometry whiz, right? But then his world is turned upside down when a sphere visits Flatland. So the black line across the center there, that's flatland. The blue bit's square, and it's kind of from a side-on kind of view. Now, let's just pretend for a sec that that square and that line is infinitesimally thin. So sphere passes through flatland like so. So what would that look like? Well, going back to what I said earlier, we're three-dimensional creatures, but we have two-dimensional vision. We can only see height and width. We can infer depth, like I can say the people at the back are further away from me, but we can't visually see it. The image that we get in our brains is two-dimensional. So what would square's vision look like? Well, square is two-dimensional. We just go a dimension down. We say it's one-dimensional. And so pretend with me that your entire field of vision is this infinitesimally small line. It's just a slit. And then one day, something pops out of nowhere. What? That came out of nowhere. That's crazy. And it gets bigger and bigger, and then it gets smaller again. It crescendos into this massive thing that takes up your full field of vision, and decrescendos back down again into this infinitesimally small point and disappears. And so what was the point of this exercise? Well, Abbott was asking a question, right? And he was saying, what would it look like if a four-dimensional object passed through a three-dimensional reality? And he does this by giving the example in a lower dimension. So applying that logic, what would it look like? Well, if you imagine an infinitesimally small red point right on my fingertip, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it fills up the entire room, and then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller again, and disappears into this tiny little dot. That's what it would look like. So here's an example of a great story that conveys this really obscure thing in a really interesting way. It's ridiculous. A square protagonist? Like, what? And so now I'd like to finish on a quote by an American engineer, Harold Edgerton, and he once said, "The key to education is to teach in such a way so that people don't realize they're learning until it's too late." And I love that. I love it so much because I think that's what stories can bring us. It can bring us a new way, a new approach of teaching something, of conveying something that really sparks the imagination, sparks the curiosity, and conveys even something complex in simple terms. And I think that's something that we can really use in our education system today. Thank you.